When historians describe the year 1906 in San Francisco, they usually focus on the devastation above ground, the violent tremors at 5:12 a.m., the collapsing buildings, the fires that burned for 3 days, the 3,000 lives lost, the 225,000 left homeless, the 4 square miles reduced to rubble and ash. But the real story, the one that barely appeared in newspapers, the one that even today sits buried in archival footnotes, began below the surface. It started with a simple emergency order. Engineers were instructed to clear debris across the ruined districts, assess structural damage, and determine whether the ground could support a rebuilt city rising from the ashes. The goal was practical: remove the wreckage, inspect foundations, and prepare for reconstruction at unprecedented speed. But the moment workers began excavating through the earthquake's shattered streets, something unexpected happened. They broke through layers that hadn't been exposed in living memory. Beneath the broken pavements, deeper than any known construction reached, the crews found tunnels and chambers that didn't match any city planning records. Their alignment was unusual, their scale was massive, and the engineering didn't resemble anything in the municipal archives of the era. It didn't even resemble American infrastructure as commonly understood. This wasn't mentioned in the public reports about reconstruction. It didn't make it into the newspapers celebrating San Francisco's resilience. But in the internal notes of that year, a quiet phrase appears over and over again: pre-existing passages, unexpected infrastructure, origin unknown. The official story would later simplify all of this into old mining tunnels, abandoned sewer lines, or simply collapsed utility corridors. Nothing unusual, nothing worth discussion. But the recovery photographs from the time, the ones developed in dim offices while San Francisco rebuilt itself in record time, show something different. They show workers standing beside tunnel walls cut with precision far cleaner than any drill of the era should allow. Passages fitted with track beds and guide systems so uniform that even in the poor lighting of 1906 photography, the engineering is unmistakable. Infrastructure that doesn't resemble any known transportation method, but something older, more sophisticated, more deliberate. And the deeper they explored, the more the passages stopped looking like utilities or mining, and more like a transit system that had been built, operated, and deliberately buried. At first, the recovery teams tried to categorize everything in the simplest way possible. Old water mains, abandoned cable car tunnels, natural fault lines opened by the earthquake. But as notes accumulated and more passages were discovered, the inconsistencies multiplied. Why were some of the tunnels built with dimensions that matched no known vehicle of any era? Why were certain passages shaped with channel systems as if designed for something other than wheeled transport? Why did some corridors extend for miles beyond any documented construction project? And the question that troubled even the most experienced engineers: why were these tunnels so perfectly graded? San Francisco's terrain is notoriously steep, yet the pre-existing tunnels beneath parts of the city appeared engineered with gradients so perfect, so carefully calculated, that the earthquake had barely disturbed them. Recovery teams quietly admitted among themselves that the precision and scale didn't line up with any known contractor or municipal project. And although none of them were using terms like lost civilizations, they were acknowledging something just as unsettling. Someone had built a transportation network here before. Not footpaths, not cable car routes, something far more advanced. As the documentation increased, so did the silence. Reports became shorter, descriptions became vague, photographs stopped showing the widest views of the discoveries. And then the original passages were partially incorporated or sealed in late 1906 and early 1907. Absorbed into new construction where useful, and buried where they raised too many questions. Only fragments remain. notes, a handful of photographs, and the quiet testimonies of archivists who saw the files before some of them disappeared. But even from what survives, a pattern becomes visible. Passages too uniform for natural formation, engineering too precise for the accepted timeline, construction methods that look inherited rather than invented, infrastructure that seems to belong to a different era of building entirely. And this is where modern researchers begin asking questions that the 1906 teams could barely articulate. Was San Francisco's reconstruction built above a forgotten transit system? Were earlier engineers repurposing tunnels they didn't fully understand? And why did so many parts of the discovery remain undocumented, sealed, or simply erased from the maps? The first anomaly was connectivity. Each passage, whether found in the financial district south of Market or Telegraph Hill, seemed to follow the same design logic, the same dimensional standards, the same engineering principles. Different neighborhoods shouldn't do that. Different contractors, different decades, different purposes. They don't build in perfect standardization across an entire city. Yet beneath San Francisco, they did. Tunnels from one district connected to tunnels in the next. Passages lined up with passages found in entirely different elevation zones. Trackbeds shared the same specifications even when separated by miles. It was as if every component was part of an original network, one that no longer existed in any historical record. As the workers explored deeper, the passages became stranger. Beneath the expected rubble and occasional cable car remnant, they began encountering infrastructure that looked nothing like 19th century construction. Much larger tunnels, much more precise dimensions, patterns that seemed too mathematically uniform for anything in San Francisco's documented timeline. Some passages appeared almost over-engineered, curved sections with flawless geometry, crafted with precision that didn't match the crude tools of the Victorian era. Walls so smooth they reflected lamplight. Floors so level that survey equipment showed tolerances tighter than contemporary construction could achieve. If you're finding this investigation compelling, consider subscribing. These mysteries don't fit neatly into official history, and uncovering them requires looking where conventional narratives refuse to go. And then came the discovery that puzzled even the most conservative members of the engineering teams. Hydraulic channels, not simple drainage or natural streams, but engineered conduits running parallel to the main passages. Lower channels with pressure-rated construction, reservoir chambers with intake systems, infrastructure that only makes sense for liquid-based propulsion. Yet there is no historical record of any water-powered transportation system beneath San Francisco. No documents showing hydraulic transit or canal networks at these depths. Nothing that explains why large sections of the deepest passages look like they were designed to move vehicles using pressurized water rather than steam, cable, or horses. Recovery photographs taken during the cleanup show this clearly. Workers standing beside channel systems so precisely cut that the men look primitive in comparison. Conduits machined so uniformly that even today hydraulic engineers study the archival images in disbelief. Gradients and curves that resemble modern infrastructure far more than anything early 20th century America is credited with. But the most unsettling detail was not what appeared in the photographs. It was what didn't appear in the archives. The official reports written after the reconstruction barely mention these features. Some drawings omit the secondary passage systems entirely. Certain tunnels are summarized with vague terms like earthquake damage or earlier excavations, even though the photographs show they were far more complex than that. The silence is hard to miss, because if these deeper discoveries truly belong to known historical periods, why weren't they described in detail? Why weren't the unusual hydraulic systems documented thoroughly? Why were the photographs scattered across private collections instead of gathered into a single municipal report? Even some of the tunnel walls raised a red flag. Surfaces too smooth, dimensions too uniform, channels too precisely graded. Marks that looked less like hand cutting and more like mechanical boring. Boring that, according to the conventional timeline, didn't exist when those tunnels were supposedly carved. The deeper the teams explored, the harder it became to fit these findings into the clean, linear narrative of San Francisco's history. Because passage by passage, the ground beneath the city began to look less like geology and more like a buried transportation network. A system built, operated, and buried at some point before recorded history, yet somehow remaining functional enough that 1906 engineers could simply build on top of it. When the recovery teams pushed deeper into the ruined districts, the discoveries stopped resembling anything that belonged to a clean and orderly historical timeline. What they began uncovering were systems that didn't match American engineering, didn't match Victorian design, and didn't even match each other in any conventional sense. Instead, they formed a strange engineering language, one that seemed to come from a unified source, yet somehow predated everything in the historical record. The first shock came with the junction chambers. These weren't crude intersections or simple utility spaces. They were geometrically perfect rooms, chambers shaped with exact dimensions, archways that held their curve flawlessly despite the earthquake, and channel systems laid out with coherence, almost like the remnants of a master station that no longer exists in any archive. Some chambers were filled completely with earthquake debris so dense that workers thought they had hit collapsed sections. But once cleared, they revealed interiors that looked untouched since the day they were sealed. Smooth walls, precision channels, and infrastructure that raised more questions than answers. And then came the feature that still puzzles researchers today: the pressure regulation systems. Officially, they were later labelled as old water mains or abandoned pump equipment. But nothing about them fits typical municipal water systems. These were too symmetrical, too precisely constructed, and too perfectly integrated with the channel networks, as if they were designed to control water flow at enormous pressures. Some regulators were large enough to fill entire chambers. Others contained internal mechanisms that appeared designed for precise flow control at speeds far beyond any contemporary system. Workers from 1906 described them in private correspondence as engineered valves, not utility equipment but control systems with a transit purpose, though no one could say what that purpose might have been. Another anomaly appeared in the track beds themselves. These were not simply flat tunnels awaiting rails. Many were shaped with guide channels, grooves that made no sense for wheeled vehicles, but perfect sense for something that floated or was propelled by water pressure. They were integrated into the tunnel floors themselves, carved with precision that suggested the entire passage was designed as a single hydraulic system. It created an uncomfortable possibility. The streetcars and cable cars above ground may not simply run on convenient routes. They may follow paths directly above something much larger, a transportation network whose purpose was never recorded, never taught, and never explained in the official history of San Francisco. The deeper the workers explored, the stranger the findings became. Tunnel sections appeared with perfectly uniform dimensions. Some surfaces were polished smooth, almost frictionless. Others showed precision cut lines so clean that modern tunnel boring engineers still argue about what tools could have produced them. But the discovery that caused the most confusion was the material lining certain sections. Some passages were coated with substances that 1906 chemists couldn't identify. Others showed crystalline structures that only form under conditions far beyond any known construction technique. The official explanation offered later: mineral deposits, natural geological processes. But that does not explain why these materials appear as uniform linings, not random formations. Applied, engineered, designed to reduce friction or contain pressure. That kind of construction requires techniques far beyond Victorian capability, far beyond anything recorded in American history. Soon after these discoveries, something unusual began happening. Chambers were filled with rubble again. Side passages were blocked. Deep sections of the original network were cut off from the reconstruction zones. Some of this was officially labelled as safety concerns necessary to prevent further collapse. But the decisions about which chambers to block first and which areas to bury permanently raised quiet questions among observers, because the spaces that were closed immediately were always the ones that contained the most anomalous features. The pressure regulators, the guide channels, the unknown coatings, the junction chambers that seemed to connect to passages extending far beyond the reconstruction area. These connecting passages were perhaps the most mysterious find of all. They weren't random tunnels, they were part of an organised pattern, a grid of routes that looked less like utilities and more like a continental network. Aligned, standardised, planned, as if they once connected every major district of the city through an underground system we no longer acknowledge. And yet, almost as soon as they were discovered, many were sealed again. Their entrances blocked, their purpose unexplored, their existence quietly removed from subsequent maps. When you study the final phases of the 1906 reconstruction, something becomes impossible to ignore. The exploration didn't end. It was stopped. Not completed, not concluded, stopped. The deeper the teams went, the more the tone of their notes changed. Early entries were confident, almost routine. But by the end, the language becomes cautious, vague, and strangely incomplete, as if someone else suddenly controlled what could be written down. And this is where the final mystery begins, because the last passages they opened beneath San Francisco weren't ordinary. They weren't utilities, they weren't mining tunnels, they weren't even identifiable as any known type of construction. They were something else entirely. Multiple reports, the few that survived, described engineering that suddenly shifted from the familiar to the unexplainable. Tunnel walls with tolerances so tight you couldn't fit paper between the stones, curved passages shaped with precision that early 20th century America was never supposed to have. Chambers built to house mechanisms far larger than anything documented in the surface world, and routes that extended beyond the reconstruction zone, disappearing into darkness beneath the rebuilt city. But here's the part that always gets buried. The most advanced sections were the passages that were sealed the fastest. Workers described filling entire junctions back in, blocking entrances, collapsing tunnels that had just been discovered. It wasn't gradual, it was immediate. The official explanation: structural instability, safety concerns, reconstruction priorities. But if it was only about safety, why were the oldest, most precisely engineered passages the ones sealed first? And why were the obviously damaged sections left accessible for utility work? It doesn't make sense unless those deeper discoveries posed a different kind of threat. Not a physical one, a historical one. Because if the infrastructure beneath San Francisco truly showed engineering far beyond Victorian capability, and if some of those passages didn't match any known contractor or era at all, then the entire accepted story of American urban development begins to collapse. Imagine what it would mean if a modern city was built on top of something far older, something sophisticated, something engineered, something we didn't build. Imagine what it means if the tunnels weren't just convenient geology, but the remains of a continental transportation system that predates recorded history. And maybe that is why the 1906 discoveries were quietly sealed. Not to protect the routes, but to protect the narrative. The surviving photographs tell their own story. Workers standing in passages that look almost modern. Channel systems that resemble hydraulic engineering. Infrastructure too integrated for its supposed age. These aren't the kinds of discoveries historians like to explain. They're the kinds they prefer not to talk about at all. And that brings us to the final question. Why was the deepest evidence, the most sophisticated infrastructure, the most anomalous passages sealed away again? Because when you step back, the pattern becomes clear. The precision tunnels were buried, the water channels were buried, the pressure systems were buried, the junction chambers were buried, the unknown coatings were buried, and even parts of the photographic record vanished, almost as if the reconstruction had accidentally revealed a chapter of history that wasn't supposed to surface. A chapter older than the gold rush, older than recorded settlement, older than the narrative we were given. And for one brief moment in 1906, the earthquake opened the ground just enough to show it. But instead of studying it, they closed it again, sealed it, filled it, forgot it, or pretended to. Because if San Francisco's streets run above a transportation network built by a civilization we no longer acknowledge, then the real question is not what was discovered in 1906. It's what else lies beneath the cities of the world. What other earthquakes? What other disasters? What other convenient destructions cleared the surface just long enough for someone to bury what was below? The Tartarian transit tunnels beneath San Francisco weren't just abandoned infrastructure from a forgotten era. They were a glimpse, a brief accidental glimpse, into a version of history we were never meant to see. And now that glimpse is your clue, your map, your invitation to question everything we think we know about how our world was really connected. Because if this is what survived under one city, imagine what still flows in the darkness beneath the rest. Something out of place, something out of time. Thanks for watching, and if you found this interesting, well, there are a lot more cities with stories like this. Maybe I'll see you in the next one.